Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to do another upgrade video, but it's also going to be very much a tech talk style video. So we're going to dive into some technical issues and talk about some things that all you guys out there in the DIY world can grab something out of it. And today's speaker is from Zoo Audio. And before I get started, I want to also throw a shout out to Erwin. Erwin sent me this cool shirt from Germany. Erwin knows I like soccer. I've played soccer all my life, love soccer. And it's really cool for me to get these shirts from over in Europe that are of different soccer teams. This one's from TSG. Looks cool, and I thank you very much, Erwin. Now, let's get started with the Zoo Dirty Weekend 6 Superfly. Yeah, that's quite a name. It's got it all in there. And just the name itself kind of tells you all you need to know about the company. I've met the owners in the years past. They're a couple of young guys. They have a lot of fun. They build the speakers to have fun. When they show up at shows, they're not trying to set the world on fire as far as trying to be the best sounding room at the show. They're having fun. And you can see that in this cover that goes across the woofer that comes on it. It says "Remove to Groove." And that in the name of the speaker kind of gives you the vibe of what these things are kind of meant to do. So before I get into all the measurements and the befores and the afters and what we did to it, let's look at these speakers as a whole. And I've had now, this is the third Zoo speaker that's come in. Customers have the same issues with the same requests. You know, they bought the speaker thinking it'd be high sensitivity, fun speaker, but it really doesn't have the performance that they want. It's lacking in multiple areas, and they've asked me to address multiple areas. So we're going to look at those, and we're going to talk about them and about their choices. And I know these speakers have been measured before. I'm sure other reviewers have measured them. The guys at Zoo, they know what the limitations are. This is the path that they've chosen, and they do this with the entire line. So it's not like this is new news to them or anybody else. They, by design, have some issues. And so let's start with the cabinet and the way the drivers are mounted in the cabinet. Anytime you surface mount a driver that sticks out this far, it's going to cause some diffraction issues. You got a tweeter right under it. That sound is going to reflect right off of this thing, and it's going to cause some problems. Internally on this thing, it's a big empty box for the most part. There's some foam, big blocks of foam right around the top, and that's pretty much it. The rest of this thing is empty. There is one brace in the whole speaker, and it runs from almost the top back corner diagonally down to the front, near the front where there's a port. There's a port out the back, but the brace goes from the front diagonally up the side. Not the ideal place for a brace, so it leaves all of this unbraced. It leaves most of the sides unbraced. The back has no brace on it at all. And folks, this thing resonates like crazy. A box this big should have braces here, 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 here. I mean, all through it. It should be broken up so that it doesn't have huge panel areas. And then, of course, it's good to stick something in between these areas to damp out some of these resonances, like no res. The other thing, square corners, that causes diffraction. And of course, anytime you've got a big wide baffle and you start sticking the tweeter right in the middle of it, you've got the same surface reflections on both sides, plus the diffraction here. You know, again, this should have been surface mounted, not surface mounted, but flush mounted to do away with this reflection. So there's lots of stuff going on with the cabinet and with the way the drivers are mounted that are major bottlenecks. They're limitations. There's things that it's going to be difficult to work around. And the top of the box doesn't have a brace on it, but what they did was they took holes that they've cut out of the center of other cabinets, and they just took the round-shaped MDF piece and just glued it onto the center of the top. Okay, it added a little bit of mass, but it didn't do away with the resonance problem. Imagine, if you would, the skin of a drum. Let's say this is the drum and this is the rim of the drum out here on the edges. This is where it's held tight and suspended. And we took a mass and we just mounted that mask as a disc, and we just put it right in the middle of this thing, it still flexes. It doesn't do anything to keep that panel from flexing, other than it added some mass, which lowered the resonance frequency further down. If you want to control the resonance, the thing to do is to put a brace from the edge to the edge and run it underneath it. Run something like the arch of a bridge or something. A brace that goes up the side and across the top and loops across and hits this thing and secures it so that it won't flex. That's a brace. Taking just a round circle and gluing it into the top of the speaker is not a brace. And it didn't do a whole lot, and we're going to see that in some of the measurements. Also, because this thing had such a lossy box and it had so much resonance going on all over the place, we started taking some measurements on that stuff. We took the accelerometer and we placed it in the upper side of the speaker, one in the middle of the speaker, on the back panel of the speaker, on the top of the speaker, and started taking some measurements of just the resonances of the cabinets. And let me tell you, it's a lot. Every panel on this thing has certain resonance frequencies where it really sings. And we could look at each resonance where it is at its highest and then just send a sine wave to the speaker at that frequency and then feel that panel. And oh my goodness, was it resonating a lot. So it's got all of that working against it. The other thing is the big 10-inch woofer up here has no crossover on it, which you think, oh great, nothing in the signal path. But oh no, it doesn't have a accurate frequency response. It's going to have some step loss. So what it's doing at down below 200 hertz, around 100 hertz, is about 3 dB lower in output than what it's doing up at 600 hertz. So it's got a little bit of a ramped response. Also, because there's really no network on the woofer, as it plays up higher, it has breakup modes and ringing and a lot of stored energy. So there's all of that ringing going on from the woofer. Also, with the tweeter mounted right underneath it, the tweeter only had a single cap on it. It was just a 1 microfarad cap. So the tweeter is just playing way up there, most of the top octave, and it's crossing somewhere 10 or 12K or something where this woofer's rolling off. That's a horrible idea because, one, you have to take into account your acoustic centers, and whatever that distance is, rule of thumb, you want your crossover point to be lower in frequency than the wavelength is that is this distance, in order for them to not sound like they're coming from two different sources. In other words, like as if you had your tweeter over here on the wall and your woofer over there on the wall, and they're not going to sound like one speaker. And there is a point where you get them close enough together and you get the crossover point between them low enough to where suddenly they sound like they're coming from one source. They sound coherent. They sound as if when you add a stereo pair, that the imaging begins to become in place in the middle of the sound stage and things like that. And when you separate that, where you've got a tweeter that's crossing a really high frequency and that frequency is greater than this distance, it sounds disjointed. It sounds like, oh, there's my highs and then there's my lows. It's not coherent. So that's an issue. The other issue is when you let a woofer like this play full range, or any driver like this that's a wideband driver, anytime a driver is playing a wavelength where that wavelength is shorter than the diameter of that diaphragm. In other words, the wavelength at a specific frequency, that wavelength isn't as long as the width of the diaphragm here, it beams. So let's say at a certain frequency, it's not going to play off to the sides. It's only going to play straight ahead. And very quickly, as soon as you get off axis a little bit, you don't hear anything from the woofer. The output drops off. Now, in a normal speaker where the tweeter is playing, say down to 1800 hertz or something, as this output starts dropping off in the off axis, the tweeter is there to cover that range and pick it up, so it maintains an even response even as you move left or right. Not the same situation with this speaker. As you move left or right, you don't have a tweeter playing down low enough to cover that response, so the output just drops off and it just goes away. And you only hear it if you're sitting right in front of it. So it's definitely a speaker you have to aim right at your head in order to hear the whole frequency range. You also have to be right at the woofer level for the two drivers to be in phase. Remember I said the acoustic centers are this far apart, but it's crossing at a wavelength that's only about this long. So as you move up or down, just a slight movement changes the time arrival from this woofer to the tweeter and causes them to be out of phase. And when they're out of phase, instead of them summing, it's just a huge hole in the response, just 15 dB suck out, because it's out of phase at that frequency. As you move up higher, the wavelength where they're out of phase may shift to a lower frequency, and you have a big dip there, and maybe a hump, and then another dip where it's out of phase at a different level. So you've got ranges that are completely out of phase as you move off center. And I say off center because we took a lot of measurements on this thing to find that it measured the smoothest if you were right at the woofer axis. So if you stay at woofer axis with it aimed at your head, you'll hear the whole range. However, you've got so much surface area here in baffle that's part of the speaker that if you aim it right at you, all of this surface area and all this surface reflection from this area is going to come right at you also, and it's going to cause the sound to perceive as if it's coming from each speaker. Versus if you tow them off axis a little bit so that that surface reflection doesn't come right at you but goes more past you. So you're not sitting in the direct reflection area, you're a little in the off axis. That helps a lot in keeping the speaker from sounding directional. However, as soon as you do that, the off-axis response is going to completely start falling apart on these things. So it's kind of a catch-22, whereas there's no free lunch anywhere anywhere that you sit in front of these speakers. The other thing is this tweeter, which is a compression driver tweeter, and then they've milled this huge chunk of aluminum into this waveguide, which looks really cool. And it's probably pretty expensive to have made. However, it doesn't work very well. And I say it doesn't work very well because it completely jacks up the response. The frequency response of this thing, there's your compression driver, and it's got extra little pieces of screen in front of it. Looks nice, but I imagine this costs more to make than the whole tweeter costs. The frequency response from this thing, again, completely jacked. The top end has a humongous peak at the top, like a 10 dB peak, and it's right at 18-20 kHz. If you're sensitive to high frequency squealing, this is not the speaker for you. This is going to take your head off and be very irritating. Unless you're an old guy and you don't hear anything above 10K at all, that is going to be an aggressive ringing, and the measurements bared that out. So there was a lot going on here, and I didn't know what I could fix and what I couldn't fix, but I took a shot at it and wound up going a little different direction, as you may guess by looking over at the box here and seeing that there's a completely different tweeter in there, and I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. But first, let's look at all the measurements and see if the measurements confirm everything that I've just talked about. Let's start with the on-axis measurement of this thing. If you just look at it from about 600 hertz all the way up to 10K hertz, it stays within a pretty good range. In other words, it looks, plus or minus a couple of dB, and you see some ripples there, and you think, oh, that's not too bad. But below 600 hertz, it takes a dive down there, and it drops off 2 or 3 dB, so the bass output really doesn't match the rest of the speaker. And you can see in the frequency response measurement that peak up top. And let me tell you, that peak shoots up to 104 dB. Yeah, 104 dB. I'd say the average level of the speaker is around 95 dB, but the bass response is really down around 94 or less. So a little bit of an imbalance going on there. And then let's look at the impedance curve. The impedance curve showed a pretty good internal resonance. That internal resonance was at 189 hertz is where it's centered. And by internal resonance, I mean there's a standing wave that's going through this box, and it may be working alongside that port or something. There's something going on there to where there's a resonance that's coming back through the box as pressure in the box, and then it's re-exciting the woofer after the signal's gone, and then it's removing the woofer, moving that woofer again, and it's doing so right at that point. If the cabinet had more insulation in it to absorb some of that, it would probably not have that at all. That one's internal. Let's look at the vertical off-axis now. The vertical off-axis, you're going to have to follow along with this one. Red line is on axis. Orange line is a movement of 4 inches. So we're on the woofer axis, 1 meter away, and we're move up 4 inches. You can see how already the drivers are starting to cancel each other out. The yellow line is moving up now 4 more inches, so we're 8 inches up, and there's a lot of cancellation going on. And then the green line is 4 more inches again, 12 inches up, and you can see huge cancellations all the way down to about 3 kHz. There's a huge dip there that's almost 14 dB dip. So again, you have to stay right in line with the tweeter in order for it to have any resemblance of a accurate response. The horizontal off-axis, this is where things really get rough. Let's throw that up there and look at it again. We're going to go from red to orange to yellow to green to blue in the chart, in the measurement. And each measurement, each line represents 10 degrees off axis. And as you can see, as you start moving off axis, the response is gone. And I say gone, it's by 30 or 40 degrees off axis, it's completely gone. Now you think, well, I'm not going to set that far axis. I'm going to set on axis on these things. Okay. But you don't just hear the on-axis response in your room. You hear the on-axis plus what reflects off the sidewalls, what reflects off the floor and ceiling, and what all of the room response looks like. And when you've got a vertical off-axis with holes in the response, and you've got a horizontal off-axis that's completely fallen away, your in-room response is going to look fairly rough, because what you hear is not just what's coming straight out of the speaker. And all of those off-axis responses and things going on in the room have a big effect on the whole sound stage and what you're listening to. So keep that in mind. Now, let's look at the spectral decays on this thing, and this is where a lot is told. Take a look at this first measurement, and when we do a spectral decay, what it does is it takes the highest point and it puts it at the top, and it in the first line you see is the on-axis frequency response. It's in there. You see the tweeter peak up at the top there, the tweeter peak over at this end at the top, and then it levels out and it's choppy, and then the bass starts to drop off, and then you see the decay rate over time. And if you look at the peak up there at the tweeter, way up there, 18 kHz or so, that's not just a peak. That's some ringing going on, and it's bad. And then there's some more ringing going on down below that. One of those peaks is pretty narrow, and there's aggressive ringing going on there. And then a lot of it is hidden because that peak was nearly 10 dB louder than the speaker. In order to see the rest of what's going on, we have to bring that up 5 dB. So let's look at the next chart. Same spectral decay, but we're bringing it up 5 dB so that we can see a little further down. Normally, we want to bring the whole thing up to the top line and watch as everything drops off. And we're not even there yet. We're still 5 dB down. And you can now see that some of those traces are carrying out a little bit longer. So I moved it up again 5 dB. We still don't even have the bass level up to the top line. We're still a couple of dB down at the very bottom end. But I've moved it up now 10 dB. And now we can see a normal spectral decay where we can see the whole graph and how bad some of this stuff is ringing. There's a breakup and ringing going on in the woofer that it's an effect that causes fatigue and makes things hard to listen to, is what it really does. So that's what's going on. Next, let's look at the measurements that I took using the accelerometer. So what I did to chart this thing is I took the on-axis frequency response and I left it at the top of the chart, and I moved the whole chart from being at 5 dB increments to 10 dB increments. So it makes the frequency response look better because we're squishing it, but it's still the same. and it pushes it up to the top of the chart so we can see how loud the resonances are of the panel in relation to the on-axis response. Now, this isn't an acoustic measurement of output. It's an accelerometer measurement of output. So it's not the same as acoustic measurement, but it gives us a good representation of just how much resonance there is versus the on-axis response. And I took all of these at just 1 watt. So all these resonances that you see here on the charts that we're going to go through was with just 1 watt of input. If we bring this up to 3 watts or 4, 5, 10, oh my goodness, it's the order of magnitude of the resonances go up exponentially with the amount of power that you're putting on the speaker. That resonance really starts ramping up. It's a lot. So let's take a look at this first one. We're going to look at the graph where I've got the frequency response, and down below it is what we measured with the accelerometer, and this one was on the upper back panel, and then right below we're going to look at it in a spectral decay, which shows the resonance over time. In other words, it's showing the resonance, and then how long does that resonance ring once it's been excited at that spot. So as you can see, there's quite a resonance there, and this one has a peak that is at 526 hertz, but you can see resonances all across there. There's a lot of resonances there, but where you see it at that particular frequency, you then see a long trace where that resonance is holding a lot of stored energy. So what we did when we started doing this, we would say, okay, there's a resonance at that frequency. So then I would type in sine wave at that frequency. I'd type that frequency in and send it a 1 watt signal, continuous. And then we could put our hand on that panel and feel how much of a vibration is really there. And in this case, a lot. There was a lot of vibration there. And it reminded me again of the old electric football sets that we used to have when we were kids. We lined up all the players, and one in the back had the ball, and you turn that thing on and it go bzzz, and they just take off running across the field. This is one of those speakers you could probably lay on its side and you could set up all the players on, and at a certain frequency they would just run across the whole speaker. That's what was going on with this one. So let's look now at the top panel. And remember, the top panel had some mass added to it, and that mass probably helped drop some of this a little bit, but there's still a resonance there. And in this case, the resonance was at 459 hertz, and there's a lot of stored energy there. So that ringing went on ringing for a while. And then let's look at, let's see, the upper back panel, the middle of the back panel. We moved the accelerometer down so it was in the middle of the back panel, and whoo, there was resonance all across there. And it's a wider area than it was up top. And again, there's some of those traces there that go on for a long time. I should have stuck one on the front panel because we would have also seen a huge one on the front panel, and that one would be very audible. The next one we're looking at is the top of the side panel. So we put it right about even with the woofer on the side panel right up here. And yeah, it had a lot of resonance going on. If you look at the measurement, you see it has ringing going on all the way across. But if you look at the spectral decay, the ringing up at the high frequency tends to stop pretty quickly. But the ringing down low, right in that upper mid-range there, and this is again at 526 hertz, there's a lot of ringing there, a lot of stored energy. And then we did one in the middle of the side panel, so we're right in the middle. Now this is about where the brace runs through it, because it runs diagonally through it from the front to the back. So we're right in line with the brace. Notice what it does with the brace. Look at the output level of the resonances. You can see there that they're considerably down from the magnitude of the resonances before. If you look at the spectral decay with it, though, you can see that it's ringing. It's definitely ringing right there, but the magnitude is down quite a bit. It's about, it's over 10 dB down from the highest peak to where we're seeing the highest peaks on the other panel, or on the same panel, just higher up. So noisy box. So Next thing I did was measure the raw drivers. And let's throw up the measurement of the woofer with no crossover on it and the tweeter with no crossover on it. So if you look at the woofer with no crossover, that's the way it plays in the speaker. So that gives you an idea just how high it's getting up there, where it's rolling off. And you can see the peaks there in its response. That's where there's some stored energy there. So keep that in mind. Everywhere that thing peaked was a lot of ringing. I should have threw up or saved a spectral decay just to the woofer. We looked at it. It was not good. And the tweeter, that's this thing. That's this compression driver with this fancy waveguide on it. And as you can see from the frequency response, that's unusable. It's a mess. I went to work on this thing and put a fairly high order filter on it. I had a huge notch filter right there at that peak that's around, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5 kHz. And it didn't attack the peak at the very top. I was saving it for last, just trying to get the roll off to create any kind of roll off. And there was so much of a knee there at 2100 hertz. It took a third order filter that was fairly aggressive to try and get that out of it. And by the time I had all those parts on there and tried to match it to the woofer, the phase relationship between it and the woofer was just completely off. It was like 90 degrees out of phase. Whether you flip the polarity or not, it's still not in phase. And the voice coil on this thing, because of how deep this is and how far it sets in here, it's set back a little bit, and it just did not want to align with the woofer, and it was driving me crazy. It was just a mess. It was just to the point of unfixable, and it's also difficult to get this thing out of there. What you have to do is this thing actually has to go through the back of the speaker and stick forward, and then you have to screw this thing on it, because once this thing is on, you can't pull it out of the hole. The through hole that this thing mounts through is this diameter, and this is what flush mounts on the front of it, but you can't pull it out because it's bigger around back here on the actual driver than the through hole is for this waveguide they made. So it was a little bit of a pain to get it out. You have to have the woofer out, and you have to reach in through the woofer hole, push it forward, unscrew it, and then you can get it out in 2 pieces. So I hated that thing. That tweeter was it was unusable even in the application that they're using it in, because the top end is so bright on the thing and there's so much ringing going on that it just doesn't make any sense at all. So I thought, I think our T26 is about the same size as that faceplate they made for this thing. And I brought that thing up there and stuck it on there, and I thought, So what I did was I had to take the box drivers out, and I had to modify this through hole just a little. I had to take the little die grinder we have with a little sanding roll on it and just go around in a circle a little bit and take about maybe a millimeter off of the through hole all the way around. And I had to put a couple little notches for the terminals to poke through, and then this thing set right in. And there's a little bit of a gap around it, but it's not too bad. It's a little thicker than the thickness of my thumbnail. And once you get it in there, it really didn't look bad at all. I'm not really bothered by that. The amount that it had to countersink was about the same as this frame on here, so it fit the hole. And I thought, all right, let's see now how bad the diffraction is going to be on this woofer hanging over it and how much surface reflection it's going to have. And I wonder what the response is going to look like. So here's the frequency response of our tweeter. And while we're throwing that up, let's throw up that frequency response again of the original tweeter and the woofer with no network on it. Let's compare those 2 tweeter responses. Man, I was so thrilled when I first shot our tweeter and saw that nice smooth curve. That just really made me happy. I knew at that point I'm going to be able to blend it to this woofer, and it's going to be a piece of cake. It's not going to require a lot of parts. I'm not going to have to fight with what this thing is trying to do. It's going to be easy. And if you notice, the sensitivity on our tweeter is 95 dB. So it was easy to match it to this woofer. Barely have a little bit of resistance in line with it to pull it down to match the woofer's response. piece of cake. Let's take a look at the new crossover response. And as you can see, I've got enough of a filter on the woofer now where we've pulled the woofer's response down out of it, and we've got it back away from those areas of breakup, so we're not hearing the ringing and the breakup from the woofer cone. And that tweeter's crossing in over it on it at about 1800 hertz, which is about where we cross it with most of our X series products. So that was easy. Everything was in phase, no huge phase shifts or anything like that to have to deal with. It was perfect. Let's look at the new on-axis frequency response, and again, perfectly smooth. And then let's look at the spectral decay. When I looked at the spectral decay, I noticed a little peaked area there that was around 4 kHz, where there was just a little trace that came down, and there was a little bit there that I know is not indicative of our tweeter. I know our tweeter doesn't have any kind of peak or resonance or anything like that. So I really suspected it was diffraction off of this woofer right above it. So to test that, to see if that was true or not, what we did next was to just turn the speaker 10 degrees off axis, take another measurement, and then look at the spectral decay again. Let's throw that spectral decay up there. Let's look at the original spectral decay there, and then the spectral decay at 10 degrees off axis, and you can see the change there, and that is all from the diffraction of this. As you move it, as you tow it out just a little bit, that diffraction doesn't come right at you, and it's gone. Now there's some little smaller areas there that are down pretty low that are just surface reflections off this and edge diffractions from the edge of the baffle. A lot of those little things we just can't do anything about, but it's 100 times better than it was. The spectral decay now is super smooth and clean compared to the original, which was a disaster. In fact, let's throw up one of our spectral decays there, and let's compare it to the original spectral decay. Keep in mind all those little lines and those ridges that come out there and over time are holding each note. That's distortion. That's a type of distortion because it's not part of the input signal. That's the speaker itself, and in this case, the cone of the woofer breaking up and ringing. And now it's no longer playing up into those regions. Let's look at the impedance response now. Let's throw that up there and take a look at it, and it's nice and balanced. And there was a little, if you remember, a little hump there in the impedance where we could see a standing wave going through. I added just a little bit of fiberglass insulation down around the bottom of the cabinet, and it knocked more than half of it out of there. So a little more insulation in there to keep that standing wave from coming back up to and exciting the woofer, and that would all be gone. Now let's look at the vertical off-axis, and the vertical off-axis looks fantastic. You can go up or down in front of this speaker, and it's going to maintain an even response that it never had before. It's not going to change tonality just because you stood up. And let's look at it compared to the original vertical off-axis. Let's do the new vertical and the old vertical so you can compare. Gives you a good idea what your difference is in the room and how things sound now versus what how they sounded before. Even huger. This is really big. Let's look at the horizontal off-axis, and then let's look right below it, the old horizontal off-axis. Look at the difference there. Now you can go left or right, and it maintains a nice even response that it didn't have before. Whereas before, the whole frequency response just completely fell apart as soon as you moved off-axis. Now it's consistent. Now we've got an even response in all directions. If you look, too, at the vertical off-axis and the horizontal off-axis, let's kind of throw those up one under the other there. And if you see, as you go up vertically, you start to get a little bit of a dip as the drivers just start to go out of phase. As you go up pretty high, there's a little bit of a dip to area around 2K. And in the horizontal off-axis, the horizontal drops off an off-axis, but because of all this surface reflection, there's an area there that doesn't drop off, so it's a little more peaked there at the same frequency. And what happens when we look at a horizontal and we see something like that, typically we'll soften it in that area. But the vertical off-axis is softened in that area, so the average of the two together is going to make a pretty good even in-room response. So those two kind of cancel each other out a little bit. So overall, we're looking at a great response now. And we're looking at now a tweeter handling a lot of those frequency ranges where before it was the woofer. And there's no way that this woofer, above 2 kHz is going to compete with this tweeter. This tweeter is lighter, smaller, faster, going to have better off-axis response, going to have better detail, resolution, clarity, and it's going to improve the imaging of the whole thing. Whereas before, this thing was, oh man, now we've got something in there that's maintaining that accuracy, and the time arrival of everything is in phase. So things are going to be where they're supposed to be in the sound stage, where they probably won't. They weren't at all before. So we're putting together a little upgrade kit. This did not require a lot of parts. Didn't require much at all to have to create that nice smooth curve. So it's not a very expensive upgrade. I'm going to do a budget level with just all JB polycaps, US coils, and the Dayton resistors that are the pure copper resistors. And then I'm going to do a sonic cap upgrade for those of you who want to put sonic caps on the tweeter, which this really responds well to sonic caps. That's going to bring resolution and detail levels up quite a bit. So if you want to do that, it's going to be an option. You're going to get all new wiring, a set of tube connectors to replace those binding posts back there. And you're going to get 3 sheets of no-res. And the 3 sheets of no-res is a biggie. There's a brace to go running through this thing, and we'll throw that picture up again and look at that brace. It's just cut full of holes. It's like they just drilled holes in the thing. Get in there with a jigsaw or something and just cut a circle out of that thing. Cut a big something out of the center of that thing and get some of that out of the middle. It doesn't need to have all that lattice of material down the middle of it. And then it'll give you a big enough hole you can reach through, and you can get to the back panel and you can stick as much no-res down through this thing as you can. The no-res is going to really tighten up those cabinet resonances. And if you added a little bit of bracing, if you went in there and you add a few little dowel rods or something from the front to the back or front to the sides and stuff like that, and just tighten it up a little bit so that it won't flex, and then add the no-res all around it, now you're really dampening out the resonances and you're keeping the panels from flexing, and it's gonna quieten that down by quite a bit. We've noticed on a speaker this lossy, where you've got a lot of vibration going on, when we measure that with accelerometer and then we put no-res on it, the no-res can knock that resonances down 10 to 15 dB, which that's pretty considerable. You take 10 to 15 dB of noise out of a speaker and drop that down. That's really, really noticeable. You're going to have tighter bass, cleaner non-resonant bass, cleaner vocals. I mean, that alone is going to transform the whole speaker. We're going to put all that into a package together for you and allow you to turn what was maybe a fun speaker into not only a fun speaker, but an accurate speaker, a speaker that images better, a speaker with resolution that it never had before. So it's going to transform this thing, and it's not going to be that expensive. The kit's going to include the tweeters too, all that in a package, and we'll have that up online before the video launches, so you can go in and check the pricing, and you can see what it's going to cost to add the sonic caps to it and all that. So a fun little project, and hopefully a good, if you stuck with me this long, thank you very much. A good educational video for all you DIY guys, because we covered a lot of don'ts this time. A lot of things you want to avoid. Those are things to remember when you do your own speakers, and that's it for this one. See you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching, and hit the subscribe button if you haven't. See you.